I'm going to start the recording. Alrighty. Good evening, everyone. My name is Chelsea Savage. I'm the class of 2021, and I'm the Assistant Director for Early Engagement with the Office of Alumni and Family Engagement.
Hi, all. I'm Serena Sewell. I'm Davidson class of 2019. I'm the Assistant Director of Annual Giving with the Fund for Davidson. Very happy to see you all tonight.
We are thrilled to have the opportunity to welcome each of you to the class of 2013 sponsored Back to School class, featuring Aisha, Shah, Robert Abare, Quinn, Libson, and Yuxi. Before we get started, I want to go over a few Zoom keeping items. First, all participants have been muted and will remain muted throughout the event. If you're comfortable and have not already, change your Zoom name to your first and last name. We ask that you do that now. You can rename yourself by clicking the participants button at the bottom of your screen, hovering your mouse over your name, and then clicking the more button. Feel free to add your Davidson class here if you have one as well. The chat feature is available. If you have questions for our panelists during the presentation, please send them through the chat to Serena or myself. We will share them with the panelists during the formal Q&A period. Please note that the panelists will not be monitoring the chat, so please do not send questions directly to them. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. For optimal viewing, we recommend hovering your mouse at the top of the black Zoom screen and you will see View pop up. If you click that and then select side-by-side speaker view, you'll be able to see all of the speakers in the center of your screen and the speaker to your right. In addition, we have enabled live audio transcription for this call. If you would like to enable this on your end, you can hover over the live transcription button on your screen and subtitles should appear. Please note that the captions are not always accurate, so we ask for your grace and understanding. If you have a tech issue, please send a chat to Serena. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists and turn it over to Rob Abare.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rob Abare. I'm going to start with a round of introductions. So starting with myself, currently I am the Senior Manager of Executive Communications at Accion. We are a global nonprofit that focuses on expanding the reach and quality of financial services for low income and underserved communities around the world. So we work in Latin America, Asia, Africa, and North America. And before that role, I was the blog editor at the Urban Institute, which is a think tank. And I cut my teeth in communications and storytelling right here at Davidson College in the College Communications Office. I was a media relations fellow working under John Sim and Bill Giddes, and really learned some valuable communication skills in that job. I'm always thankful for that. And of course, I was an English major, so shout out to all the English majors out there. All right, so now I'm going to introduce our awesome panelists. Thank you all so much for joining us. Starting with Aisha Shah, who is a public relations professional with a focus on social impact, arts and culture, and storytelling on digital platforms. In her current role, she supports corporate affairs for GoFundMe, which is the very familiar fundraising platform that you may have heard of. She's based in Washington, D.C., and previously she served as Deputy Director of Partnerships at the White House in the Biden administration. Welcome, Aisha. Thank you so much for joining us. All right, next we have Quinn Libson, who is a freelance writer, editor, and audio producer based in Phnom Penh, Cambodia since 2018. Her work has appeared in NPR's Weekend Edition, New Narrative, South China Morning Post, and elsewhere. Quinn mentors emerging Cambodian researchers as part of her role as in-house editor for Future Forum, which is a Cambodian independent public policy think tank. And she also serves as vice president of the board of the Overseas Press Club of Cambodia. Hello, Quinn. Thanks for joining. And then we have Yuxi Lin, who is a Chinese-American writer and AAWW Margins Fellow and winner of the Breakout 8 Writers Prize. Her writing has appeared in Poetry, the Washington Post, the Southern Review, Michigan Quarterly Review, the Electric Literature, and elsewhere. She's received support from the Millet Colony for the Arts and the, I'm going to mispronounce this, Jurassic Resident Artist Program. And Yuxi received her MFA from New York University, where she was a Lillian Vernon Fellow. And she lives and teaches in New York. And so I'm very excited to have Yuxi here to help shed some more light on the creative side of storytelling, and also, how to engage audiences in the classroom. So thank you for joining, Yuxi. All right, so getting right to it, I think for our first question for our panelists, I would like to zoom out a bit. So we often think of storytelling, as sort of like the most fundamental and best way to engage and involve audiences with information. But I would like to ask our panelists if they think that this is actually still true today, or do modern audiences really just want to be fed information as quickly as possible with no frills or stories in order for that transaction to happen. So I'd like to ask, in other words, like, what does storytelling itself mean to you? And how do you think storytelling has changed in the 10 years since we graduated from Davidson? So Quinn, I would love to start with you.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting question. And I think that my perspective is really informed by my background in journalism. Oftentimes, what we are served as audiences is too often linked to what the revenue model can support. And I think that at the moment, there's actually some evidence for audiences really having an appetite for these longer, more engaging stories, for people to really have time to sit in somebody else's experience. When you think about long form mediums, like podcasts that keep people hooked for up to an hour, when you think about a platform like YouTube, where the common knowledge or kind of the idea of what audiences could tolerate was maybe 3 minutes max, really proves not to be true. There are stories out there that really require engagement from audiences, and audiences actually want that, in my experience. But the revenue model and the business aspect of it is, I think, what's being kind of acting as a gatekeeper to keep those stories from even being able to reach audiences.
Sorry, I muted myself. Thank you, Quinn. Appreciate it. Aisha, let's go to you next.
No worries. Thanks. I'm gonna have to keep from calling you Abare. I call Rob Abare by his last name. But I totally agree with Quinn that I actually wish that people's attention spans hadn't winnowed in the way that they have, sort of with the rise of social media. And I think that's really dangerous in a lot of ways. However, I do think the speed at which we consume information and storytelling, albeit short form storytelling, has actually really flourished in some ways. So in addition to platforms that empower people to share their own stories, TikTok, Instagram, things like that, experiences and sort of personal narratives, the ability for anybody to curate content with imagery is, I think, at this moment really unparalleled. And I think is the other side of what Quinn was sort of mentioning. And, to me, storytelling is really the ability to share a narrative in your own words and connect that narrative to an audience that it'll resonate with, educate, or both. I think the tricky thing is that when you're working to tell someone else's story, or you're helping to amplify a story, ensuring that you understand like whose stories are getting lifted up the most, what's getting the most visibility, are we ensuring there's sort of equity in that? And I think that goes back to that paid piece, which can be really tricky when a lot of that is like gamified towards a business model that doesn't necessarily promote equity. So I think there's sort of good and bad in the other side of things as far as storytelling and digital media.
Interesting. I definitely agree with a lot of what you said, Aisha. Thank you. All right, Yuxi.
So coming from the realm of poetry, where words cannot really be monetized, I have a very different relationship to storytelling. I think that, I guess it's a gift or a curse, depending on how you look at it, that poetry is so separate and that it's so niche. That for me, storytelling through poetry, and I think most of forms of writing that I engage with, it's really about feeling seen. And when I read a story that feels like someone's just like reaching in with their hand into my rib cage and just like gripping my pathetic little heart as a reader, that's when I feel the strongest kind of connection, and it's incredibly intimate. And I hope that I can do that to someone else as well. Because I think this is something that's very sacred. It's, we have so few forms of real, genuine connection and ways to do that with people these days, that sometimes words are just all we have. And so I think that for me, it's word making is part of the, what makes me feel most alive. And I think, Rob, to your question about what has changed in the last decade or so, I think that there is a real crisis, not just with writers, but with a lot of people now with, ChatGPT and AI. And what does that mean? Sometimes I have friends who are not artists say to me, oh, what are you going to do now that ChatGPT can write poetry? Because they think of poems or art in general as a product that you make. But for me, so much of art making of any kind is about the process itself, that as you make something, it changes you. And as you engage with a work of art, whether it's poetry, whether it's, visual art or theater, it's as you are engaging with it, it is transforming you in some way, that it's not just a product for entertainment and consumption. But yeah, it is still very daunting, right? Who am I witnessing when it's an AI creating this beautiful work of art? I don't know.
Right. Well,
just
I think,
in response to something that you said, if I may.
of course.
It was really, I really respond to what you said about kind of like the raw power of words. I live in Cambodia, and, here storytelling journalism is closely monitored by the government. In the last 3 years, there have been as many as 4 independent news outlets shut down by the government. I was personally affected by one of them. And so, the power of storytelling is obvious when the government is so terrified of it, when a government sees it as an existential threat. And that really does speak to kind of what Yuxi was talking about like the power of words to form connection, and to allow people to, connect grievances to decisions that are happening at the very top of the societies we live in. Yeah.
And I'm glad, Yuxi, that you brought up AI, because that's what I was going to touch on as well. I think a lot of times I notice nowadays when I explain to people what I do, that I'm a speechwriter, that I'm in communications, people are like, oh, ChatGPT is coming for you. And I do think that is true to an extent. I think, AI is extremely powerful. We've seen what it's capable of these days. But I was reading an article recently. I think it was in Gizmodo or something like that. It was an article that was written by AI about, the rise of AI and ChatGPT. And I was very relieved to see that it was really bad. And, I think we as consumers of stories should feel somewhat comforted by the fact that I think what we all want when we are consuming information or media is that we want that human connection. And I think even if AI will be able to reproduce what a human is capable of, if we're really good at transparency and making sure that everything that is produced by AI is labeled as such, then I think we will all still gravitate to that human connection that real human told stories provide. And I do think that there's some element that AI just still is not going to be able to reproduce yet. I think you definitely need that human experience in order to synthesize information in a way that people will really respond to it. And I think there's just something that you can't really do through an algorithm that's scraping through, millions and millions of tweets and whatnot. But anyway, very interesting stuff. So moving on to our next question, I'm getting to the title of the class. The social impact of storytelling is obviously very important, and I would like to hear a little bit from each of you about the strategies that you apply when you are telling stories in your either your work, your professional life, or your personal life. How do you seek to create a reaction in your audiences, and what are you trying to lead them toward? And what are you putting into your stories to get that result? So Yuxi, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so one of my favorite poets is June Jordan, and she said that the personal is political and political is personal. And I think that when I'm writing, I often am writing something about, when it's nonfiction, I usually write personal essays. When it's fiction, it's usually building off of something, maybe like a moment from my life or from what I've observed in an incident, and I use my imagination to explore it and expand. And I think that I don't set out with a specific social impact in mind. It's usually like, how can I do this story justice? How can I do these characters justice? How can I make a poem what it wants to be? So a lot of it is about letting go and let the story be what it's meant to be, which sounds very abstract, and it's very much an intuitive process. And I think that when a story is told in the form that it's meant to be, then it could make that connection with someone and make them feel seen. And sometimes it's very hard to do. Like, I've gone to readings where, like, I think in our generation, we are very great at speaking up and talking about traumas and being vulnerable, but it's very, very hard to do it in a way that doesn't then just trigger other people. Like, I've gone to readings where someone will just get up on stage and basically read a poem that's not exactly well crafted about something terrible that happened to them. And I don't think that is doing justice to the subject. And I think that as storytellers, we have a duty to treat those subjects with a lot of care and tenderness, and treat our audiences with that kind of respect and do it really well. And I think that's where the craft comes in. I really like this essay by Gotthold Lessing, who's this philosopher who wrote about the aesthetics and the sort of the need for beauty in art, and why it's so important. It's because we humans, we don't like the truth be told to us in its plainest form. We want there to be beauty in the hardest truth, so that we can accept it in this like roundabout, indirect way. And the poet Robin Coss Lewis puts it to me this way. She was like, well, you can tell really dark stories and that involve the difficulty and horrors and violence of human life, but you got to do it, like, distract them with these beautiful things, and then with your other hand you're doing surgery on your reader. And I think that that's what some of the most powerful storytelling does, is that we get both the beauty and also the difficult truths.
Thank you. I love how your answers themselves could be poems. It's awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Quinn, over to you.
Yeah, it's definitely something, obviously, that I think about a lot. And in the 5 years that I've been in Cambodia, I think one of the things that I've had to kind of sit with is the discomfort of the idea of me being the one to be telling some of these stories. And so over the course of the last 3 years, I've really made kind of a pivot to being in more of a trainer role, a mentor role. And so a lot of my work involves very hands-on mentoring with young Cambodian writers, many of whom are people who have never really kind of had a platform for their perspectives. partly because there are so few platforms in this country for critical discourse. But my job is to help them to see their perspectives first as important, as valuable, and also to kind of learn how to take their everyday observations, their personal experiences, the findings of their research, and combine all of that information into a compelling story that is kind of part commentary, part advocacy, part personal perspective that can be shared with the general public. So a lot of what the work that goes into that storytelling, I think the key ingredient is just paying attention. It's noticing small everyday or what feel like everyday stories here in Cambodia, and seeing the ways that those are actually part of larger trends, part of have larger import. So for example, when you see a story about government authorities knocking down the stalls of small vendors on a beach for beach beautification projects, and those people not being compensated, those people losing their access to their livelihood, you could see that as just a small incident. Or if you're paying attention, you can see that as something that forms, a larger trend. It forms a larger pattern of, the way that the government is interacting with its citizenry. And so a lot of what my work is taking those ingredients, that attention, and being able to turn it into something powerful, not for me, but for Cambodians for whom their voices actually have the potential to have an impact. When I'm telling that story, I'm just a whiny foreigner. When they're telling that story, they're a citizen who wants change, wants reform.
Thank you. Aisha, over to you.
So much of what Quinn just said really resonated with me again. I think stories really have the ability to make people feel seen, but they also have the ability to catch people off guard with their assumptions or biases. And I think oftentimes, similar to what you were saying, is I'm not necessarily the storyteller, but I'm helping a story get told. And there's a different sort of responsibility there. I used to help to pilot a program at a PR firm that worked specifically with nonprofits to teach them how to use pop culture for social change. And think this is like 7 years ago. This was when like Modern Family was groundbreaking, and it was crazy to see, a same-sex couple with a loving extended family on television. It was just not the norm. And so just by working with organizations to teach them how to leverage these sort of broader narratives within their own stories, I think it was a really interesting sort of seat to be in, to see how are other people best empowered to tell their stories by matching those with stories that maybe don't make the average person anxious. They're able to sort of find an aperture to speaking to audiences who may have misunderstood them in the past. And I think that it was always a really interesting learning experience, because you're working with like incredible advocates who stand up for, different communities that they represent. And they're telling you oftentimes they're not able to get the funding dollars that they need, or they're not able to really resonate with the audiences that need to believe in them, or they're only speaking to one different type of audience. And so I think understanding how stories are intersectional too, and how in one moment, if someone understands something, helping to connect that to something else through someone else's story can be really powerful as well. I saw this oftentimes when I was working with organizations that would work on immigration and families and things like that, issues that to some people felt political. And how do you sort of tell a story in a way that really brings the human first and sort of the policy later, but in a way that you're able to sort of like feed people their vegetables without them knowing. And so that, I think, was, you know, a moment in which I wasn't telling my own story. I wasn't the storyteller, but I was helping other stories get told to a broader audience. And I think it's a tricky needle to thread, because I do not believe in sort of like watering down things, but I do believe in sort of, how do you get to meet people in the middle so that they can change their understanding of you, if that's a goal of yours. And I think that that is sort of a strategy that I kind of hearken back to whenever I am up against people that may disagree or may not even want to engage. And so I think that was always something that was interesting for me to learn in that role.
That's fascinating. Thank you. And I love that you brought or mentioned pop culture, because I think, you know, in the world of PR and like corporate communication, so often we're setting out with this goal of like, we want to, you know, we want people to think X after they hear this story. And oftentimes when you're setting out with like that very clear goal, it's almost like your chance of success is even more difficult. Whereas like the stories that are making the biggest impact are those just in pop culture or, you know, on Netflix or what have you, because they have such huge audiences. And just that, just like the representation of someone from a different walk of life being, you know, doing some story that's just has people watching, you know, it feels like that almost has a greater social impact these days than those stories that we're actually setting out in order to like create, if that having social change is like the explicit goal. It's like, it's almost like the stories that create the most impact are the ones that didn't set out with that initial intention. Yeah. But I guess from my perspective as a speechwriter in the nonprofit sector, one strategy that I turn to is sort of very often just trying to help. First, it's just trying to really understand the audience. I think that's where I always start when I think of storytelling and what sort of impact we want to make. Very often, the CEO who I write for is speaking to a large like tech conference or a room full of people who don't normally engage in the very you know, technical work that we do. So, for example, sometimes when I speak to people about financial inclusion or the need for you know, low-income communities to have access to financial services, some people will say, well, why is that? Why do we need, why is this an issue in the first place? So very often the speeches will start out by saying, like, imagine every time you use your debit card or you use a bank account or you rely on insurance to pay for something, or you get a mortgage, or every single time that you use a financial tool, it's not necessarily something that you think about, but for, you know, literally 2 billion people out there in the world, they have little or no access to these tools that we use to manage our everyday life. So very often it's sort of just starting with that very basic sort of level set with the audience, where you're just trying to create an access point to the more technical work. All right, so now we can pivot on to our next question. So this is a slightly more personal question. What is a story that really made an impact on you as a listener or a consumer of the story? And maybe that could be a story that you encountered as a Davidson student, or one in your professional life, or in any arena. All right. I see that I have myself listed, but I am not really sure what I'm going to say yet. So I'm going to go to Yuxi.
Okay. So I struggle with this question a lot too, because I mean, I feel like I get transformed by a story at least like once a week. It's occupational hazard. But I was thinking I can just share with all of you a poem that I really loved called You.
That would be awesome. Yes.
It's by Louise Gluck, who's one of my favorite poets, and she won the Nobel Prize for Literature recently. Youth. My sister and I at two ends of the sofa, reading, I suppose, English novels. The television on, various school books open, or places marked with sheets of lined paper. Euclid, Pythagoras, as though we had looked into the origin of thought and preferred novels. Sad sounds of our growing up, twilight of cellos, no trace of a flute, a piccolo. And it seemed at the time almost impossible to conceive of any of it as evolving or malleable. Sad sounds, anecdotes that were really still lives. The pages of the novels turning, the two dogs snoring quietly. And from the kitchen, sounds of our mother, smell of rosemary, of lamb roasting. A world in process of shifting, of being made or dissolved. And yet we didn't live that way. All of us lived our lives as the simultaneous ritualized enactment of a great principle, something felt but not understood. And the remarks we made were like lines in a play, spoken with conviction but not from choice. A principle, a terrifying familial will that implied opposition to change, to variation, a refusal even to ask questions. Now that world begins to shift and eddy around us. Only now, when it no longer exists, it has become the present, unending and without form. Yeah, that's just one of the poems that I love because I think that it's, it's like a specific memory of some speaker's childhood. And I don't even know, I've never met Louise Glick. I don't know them as a child, but yeah, when I read that poem, like I know exactly what they're talking about.
I love it. Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you. I'm glad that we got a poetry reading in here. I was hoping for one. All right, Quinn.
Yeah, this is actually, I think, the hardest question. I struggle in the same way as you see, but I think having to, as someone who, yeah, for my work, I read stories constantly, to think about which ones really stick with me. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized the answer was maybe that I was like avoiding the easy answer because it didn't, it doesn't have like a larger message, but the story that I think I come back to over and over and over again is a story called The Living Room, which is from Love and Radio. It's a radio story, an audio story, and it's a story told from the perspective of a woman who is able to see into her neighbors' apartments. And it's about the ways in which just being able to see into their life, but actually know nothing about them, kind of starts to mean everything to her. It's a true story. And I think for me, it's, I think I've listened to it maybe 3 or 4 times. And it's the kind of story that even on the 4th listen, I cry. And it's one of those stories that makes you realize that even the smallest, most mundane events can have a huge impact when they're told beautifully. It kind of goes back to some of what Yuxi was saying about, beauty having to be a key ingredient in the storytelling. And yeah, somehow this story about, a nosy neighbor who happens to be able to see into the enormous picture windows of a couple living next door to her. Yeah, it's a completely transformative story, and I hope that everybody will listen to it. Yeah, it's called The Living Room.
All right, thank you. I'll check that out. Aisha.
Okay, so I have 2 answers to this because I think I interpreted it a little bit differently. I thought we were talking about like a news story that had resonated. So
that counts.
I will go first with what Quinn and Yuxi sort of like inspired me to think of first. And when I think of what are stories that I read when I was younger, sort of pre-college, that really resonated with me at a time that was extremely formative and raw. And it was a time that I like didn't feel seen or comfortable necessarily in the environment that I was in. Was Jhumpa Lahiri has a number of short stories about the immigrant experience in America. And one of the collections is called Unaccustomed Earth. And they're wonderful. There's another one called Interpreter of Maladies. But I remember reading Unaccustomed Earth, and we sort of talk about diversity and like which stories get written and what resonates with people. There's such like a pain and beauty in the way that she describes being away from the place that you are and trying to make a home in a new place. And I think at the time, I had grown up at that point, was sort of in high school, knowing that my parents had done that and having absolutely no sympathy for them and wanting to like stay out late past curfew and like go to football games and do things that I felt were uniquely American, because that is what was going to like make me the version of myself that I wanted. I remember sort of being really struck by those stories and understanding what it must have been like for them, and realizing that I was going through my own process of trying to untangle what my story would be. And I think that I don't know, it was very therapeutic being able to feel that at that formative age, and has stayed with me for a long time, and really recommend her writing. She's wonderful. But one of what my actual answer to this was that, I sort of mentioned this earlier, but a big thing for me is access to opportunity. Where does it come from? How do we promote it? Where does it get stifled? And I remember when I was working at the White House, we were working on telling stories about access to broadband, and all of the stories were sort of, our video team was incredible, and they were in like rural Kentucky at the time, which absolutely has a problem with that. And then sort of filming things doc style. And one of the stories that kept coming up was, during the pandemic, there were these two young girls that were trying to do their homework in a Taco Bell parking lot because they didn't have access to internet at home. And I remember kind of thinking, okay, this is my version of my parents telling me, like, my grandfather used to like walk 12 miles and like ride in the back of a wagon. And I didn't know that that happened in the United States, let alone in states like California, where you like totally don't, assume that to be the case. And I thought that but in addition to the story that we were continuing to tell, going back to that narrative of, you think that, all right, the pandemic hit, we're going home, we're going to be on our laptops, we're just going to work from home for a while, was something that was an assumption for everybody, was absolutely not a reality for so many people. And that story had like sort of gone viral. And I remember we used to not be able to say the word Taco Bell because it was a brand, but they would always say, like, kids shouldn't be trying to access internet in a fast food parking lot. And it really resonated with people in a way that like the other one didn't, which was unfortunate because both of them are equally important. But it was just the second one was so much more unexpected, because most people living in America don't think that that is a huge issue until you talk to educators, until you talk to people at schools, until you talk to folks who have worked with sort of those communities, that it is a huge issue. And it had brought a lot of it had brought a big spotlight to it. And I think other areas were able to talk about that issue more openly, because they were like, yes, you see, this is a problem in California. Hey, I'm in New York, or I'm in, another place, and like we're experiencing the same thing. So I remember that one just kind of sticking with me as like Americans need to know that this is not something that is super far away from them in an area that they don't know about. This is kind of like in your backyard. And so I remember thinking that that was like a powerful way to have a hook for something.
Thank you, Aisha, for sharing all that. Appreciate it. I think my answer would have to be, and also considering what everyone else has shared, I'm trying to think of something that's like slightly different, but I know one piece of content, I guess, that really made an impact or shifted my worldview would be the book People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. And funny enough, I've I saw the book on an episode of Broad City, which is, about two girls who are just like, living it up in New York City. And there was an episode of them, I think they fall into a giant pit in Central Park, and then they start reading people's history of the United States. And before I read that book, I was sort of like struggling to sort of, condense all of this, like, eye-opening and like perspective shifts in my sort of worldview that I was sort of experiencing in spurts. And I feel like this book really, by focusing on like the people who really created important movements in American history and focusing there rather than this, like, the old white men who have, were supposedly like playing chess with each other, I guess. That's like how we learn history typically. And I don't know, I just thought that book was really amazing how thorough it was. And also it was just really effective at shattering almost every, myth that I had been told growing up. It was great. Anyway.
On my list.
Yes, highly recommend. All right. So what's one story that you worked on personally that you are most proud of? Let's start with you, Aisha.
Right. So I think this is sort of a thread of what I've been saying here, but sometimes you're not necessarily the best narrator for the story that you want shared with people. And one of my most memorable moments over the past couple of years was working with Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson whenever she was confirmed. And, generally when things like that happen, there are photos and, portraits and things like that taken. And, our White House photographer is a white man who is great. His name is Adam Schultz. He captures sort of like photos and videos every single day. But in that moment, we sort of paused and we wanted the first image that was going to come out of that day to be captured by a young Black female photographer, because we just felt that it was, such a striking moment that someone who could really resonate with Justice Jackson and why this was a really big moment for her should be selected. And so we worked with Leilani Foster, who, her sort of work focuses on a tribute to Black life and culture. And just that day to see a woman of color capture one of the most momentous moments of another woman of color's life, when oftentimes that is not the lens that people are being looked at or the lens that people look out at the world. It was incredibly moving. And I remember hearing the justice's husband at one point look down at his daughters, and he looked at them and he said, like, this is what excellence looks like. And we collaborated with a number of public figures to sort of promote that image for the day. And, places like the Today Show and Vogue and things like that were able to speak with Leilani about what that felt like. And the headlines I remember were like, Justice Jackson's first portrait is a celebration of Black women at the White House. And, I was such a small part of that in just being able to connect those tissues. But it was a reminder that if you don't lean on the right voices, you don't sort of like share a narrative that people are probably like really wanting to see. And that day I was really proud that we were able to do that. And hilariously later that day, we took portraits of the president's dog and the president, which puppy portraiture is very different than what we were able to do that morning, but it was kind of a crazy day. But I remember just thinking like, we always need to be thinking more critically about like who is able to bring a story forward and who gets lifted up later to be able to tell that story. And so that was, I think, one of my favorite moments then.
All right, thank you. Let's go to Quinn.
Yeah, I think the story that has stayed with me the longest that I worked on was a story that I did for NPR's Weekend Edition. There's a pop star here in Cambodia. His name is Laura Mam. And she's Cambodian American. She grew up in California as the daughter of Cambodian refugees who had left this country in the aftermath of the Khmer Rouge. And she had returned to Cambodia and had kind of started or helped been a part of a movement to start writing original Cambodian music again. Kind of the way that the war and the genocide decimated the creative industry had meant that there had been really no new Cambodian music written for decades. And I knew about her. I knew about her story just from living here. But what I didn't realize from the way that her story had been told before was that it was really a family story. Her first song that she had kind of launched her career with, it had gone viral on YouTube, especially among the Cambodian diaspora, who really felt like this was something new. This is a new story out of a country that, you know, everyone thinks they know the story to already. That it was a song that was written by her and her mother. They had, you know, a lot of the early songs that she had written were co-written between her and her mom. And so I wanted to do a story that obviously told, you know, Laura's story, but also told the story from the perspective of what it means for her mom. You know, she's somebody who left Cambodia at the age of 18, having survived a brutal regime, who had always loved music and had grown up in a musical family, but and the idea of, you know, leaving a war-torn country and then having your child return to that country and become a pop star was a story that was just, you know, unimaginable to me, and kind of the full circle feeling of kind of being you know, a continuation of a family that was destroyed by a war was something that I think, you know, if my journalism career or my writing career ends tomorrow, I would feel proud at having been able to, you know, tell that family story. And obviously it was a huge thing for me to have a story that I did end up on NPR, but honestly the most exciting, the most impactful part of it was just getting messages from Laura and her mom, Tita, afterwards, just saying, you know, what it meant for them to have, you know, not just Tita's story out into the world, but to hear, you know, the legacy of the family members that were lost in the war and lost in the genocide, to have those stories be told. Those are, you know, messages that obviously mean the most in terms of, you know, that's the audience that I was most excited to be able to interact with, was these women themselves.
Thank you, Quinn. That sounds awesome. And I need to check out that NPR story.
I was going to say, drop it in the.
Yes, can you drop that? All right, Yuxi.
Story that I am most proud of is this essay that I wrote called Love Song to Costco for long reads. And I wrote it thinking, I was just like, oh, I want to write about Costco because it was such a big part of my childhood as an immigrant. And my Chinese family, we would go there for every weekend. It was like a ritual for us. And it was always a weird, fascinating experience watching my parents wander through the aisles of Costco and just sort of feeling very comforted in this warehouse of abundance. And when I shared it with my POC friends, they were like, oh my God, like me too. Like we all went to Costco and we all love Costco for some reason. And so I was like, oh, okay, so I guess it's resonating with people. And so I pitched.
I commiserate with that, Yuxi. It was Sam's Club for us, but.
But yeah, and it was an essay through which I was exploring my parents' history growing up in the Cultural Revolution, my family history with food scarcity, and it was also a lens through which I could explore my relationship with my parents, which had become more strained over the years. And so after this essay went up, it went viral, and somehow I had people reaching out to me about it. And I was like, how do you know about this? And be like, oh, it's on Hacker News. I was like, what? It has nothing to do with tech. And then I went on Hacker News, and there were all these people commenting, and most of the comments are not even about the story. People were just like, well, did you know there's a new Costco in Switzerland? And did you know they also have a pharmacy for cats? Like, but even though a lot of times it's like not even relevant to the story itself, it was fascinating to see that people, like especially immigrants, were having conversations around this and bonding over it. And I also have people just randomly email me and be like, hey, I have this strained relationship with my parents too, but your essay made me rethink maybe I should forgive them, and maybe they experience things that I haven't really considered. So that was really rewarding for me to just know that like my story resonated with other people, and that it could also maybe even improve their relationship with their parents too. So that was really fascinating experience.
That's awesome. That's another link that I will need in the chat if possible. Thank you, Yuxi. I will say, for me, one story that I worked on that really made an impact on me and that really shaped the trajectory of my career would be an essay that I wrote at Davidson in Dr. Lewis's reported creative nonfiction class. So this was a class on creative nonfiction, and for our capstone paper, we had to basically go out and, create a reported creative nonfiction piece on any topic that we wanted. So I really wanted to do something that would make me uncomfortable, I guess. So I wrote about gun owners who are Christian and who, are very vocal about the two. So I went to a gun show in Charlotte, and I went to a gun store in, I think it was Mooresville, and I spoke to a leader of a Black church in Charlotte who had a armed guard at his church, and who also did a gun buyback program in Charlotte. So it was really interesting to sort of just speak to people about two elements of their belief system that they don't typically reconcile or equate with each other, and hear what they had to say. There were some really interesting things said. And at the other side of things, people the Christian community that was actively trying to get guns off the street at the same time. So it was sort of interesting for that perspective too. And then by creating that essay, it really helped me realize that I wanted to keep doing this sort of work into my professional life. All right, so we don't have much time left, so I think we should open it up to questions now. And if there aren't any questions from the audience, I would like to remind the panelists that you can ask questions of other panelists as well. So any questions from anyone, for any of us? Oh, this is when I need a list of questions to ask, in addition to ones I've already written. Paul, you're on video. It looks like you've got a question.
I had all these questions, and it turns out you asked them all, which is crazy. What are the odds that all the questions I had you asked? No, this has been amazing. Thank you guys so much. It's been really interesting. Good to see you all too.
Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.
Hey, Bear, I'll ask a question.
All right. Thank you, Bill.
I apologize if it was asked before I hopped on the call. I was a little bit late. What from the group of panelists' memory, what was something that you learned at Davidson or experienced in a class that you've kept with you in your career, or has informed the trajectory of what you do, or you see, especially for you, that you bestow on your students now?
Yeah, I can take that one first. So when I came to Davidson, I didn't think that I was going to be a writer at all. I didn't think that I had a story to tell. I didn't think I was someone who could tell stories on behalf of anyone anyway. And it wasn't until Alan Michael Parker during office hours one day was like, do you want to be a writer? And I was like, I didn't know that was an option. I don't know. And he was like, it's a yes or no question. And I was like, yes. But it was very, very tentative. But it was very helpful to just have that seed be planted, to know that it was an option, and to just have someone look me in the eye, acknowledge me and see me and say, you have the potential to do this thing that you didn't think was possible. And I think that was extremely powerful. And I try to give that gift to my students too, because I see how much they need to feel seen and heard, and to be told and affirmed that they have a story and they have a voice. Even when it's not super obvious that they are in need of that, like, they still need it.
An answer
Yeah,
to
Oh,
you go
sorry.
first, Quinn. No, you go first.
I think my answer actually happened immediately post Davidson, but was still under the Davidson umbrella. My first job out of Davidson was as assistant resident director for the Davidson in India program. And maybe it's because, I was kind of like half out of the nest of Davidson, having to like really think very seriously about like what I was going to be doing with my life after the program ended. Still within that context of Dr. Mankhouse's program on the politics of the Indian Ocean. It was kind of this like madcap program where we were going to be in India and Sri Lanka and Oman and the UAE, and thinking about, the littoral relations of like India, the Gulf, East Africa, et cetera. And I think being still kind of like wrapped in the Davidson cocoon, but obviously so much outside of the context of Davidson, gave me space to really look around me and start to think about, okay, what are the stories that I see around me that I wish more people knew about? We were meeting, for example, the women at the college where this Davidson program was based. The female students had a 6 p.m. curfew at which they had to be back in their dormitories. And the male students could just gallivant around, to whatever time they wanted. So I was like thinking about that story and the inequity of it, thinking about the stories that I was seeing all around me, and wishing that there was, a way to convey some of these stories, whether it's to American audiences or just audiences, that would care about these events, care about these people. And then I think maybe it was being in the Davidson cocoon that made me realize that like I could be somebody's telling these stories, that the idea of being in the journalism industry, which felt so far away, all of a sudden felt like it was something that was maybe doable. It's definitely a really formative experience for me that was wrapped up in my Davidson experience as well.
I guess just going off of what was shared, my sophomore year, I took a class at Davidson with Dr. Shireen Campbell called Writing with the Community, which was focused on the history of civic engagement at Davidson and how the college had helped to sort of shape and amplify stories of community members, including like long beloved places like Ada Jenkins. And I just had never, hearing Yuxi recite poetry it makes me want to be back in a classroom so much. And it is so beautiful because I like realize hearing you that I just like thirst for that kind of thing, because I have been pivoted into the other end of writing. And I think when I was at Davidson, I was like so surrounded in surrounded by and steeped in that. But I think it was this class that really helped me understand, how my sort of like English major could be applied with different impact organizations outside, because we had learned about so many of them and worked with so many of them. But even more important than that, it helped me understand the value of like voice and whose it was, when you should use your own, the importance of diversity, and sort of like what it means to sort of like share someone's story as an ally, and then like, ensure that people's stories are also shared themselves. And it sort of set me on a path to using those skills in philanthropy and government and in different places. But I am realizing now that I am like yearning for more of what Yuxi is sharing as well, just as an adult right now. So it like reminds me that you can always be like a lifelong learner and sort of consumer of art whenever things feel really fast in the world.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us, Aisha, Yuxi, Quinn, and thank you to Chelsea and Serena as well so much for all your support setting this up and everything that you're doing to make our 10th reunion a reality. And we appreciate you. All right. I think that concludes. Anything else to add, Chelsea?
Well, just really quickly, just to let everyone know, this event was recorded or is being recorded and will be available on the website in around a week or so. We'll post it to our YouTube channel. And I just wanted to repeat what Rob just said. Thank all of you for joining us today, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your night.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. And thank you to Rob who organized it. Yeah, it was really lovely to be.
Big thanks to Abare.
Thanks, guys.